Thank you all for staying to the bitter end, or at least the beginning of the bitter end. I'm John Givens from Kennesaw State. My co-author, Deborah Lamb, couldn't be here. She's from Georgia Tech. She's the real... can you hear me, or do I need to stand real close?
It's better if you stand real close.
You can also sit if you want.
Okay, so she's the real smart cities expert. My expertise is primarily Chinese law, and so we're going to talk about kind of this project, which is still very initial, is to talk about what we kind of can learn, in many cases, in fact, most cases, what not to do from Chinese advances in smart cities and what kind of protections we might have that are different. So City Labs called 2018 the year of the smart city skeptic for a lot of reasons. These are privacy concerns at places like Facebook and Google, but also the failure of things like ride-sharing apps or Airbnb to fix some of cities' problems, right? Maybe even making them worse. And similar but different failure of technologies like AVs, autonomous vehicles, to help fix traffic. So one of the most ambitious projects, and it's been brought up a number of times already here, is the K-Side project in Toronto, the most ambitious smart city project in North America. It's met with fierce opposition, both from public comments, but 3 of their board members had to resign, 3 of their board members were fired. And the Canadian Civil Liberties Union has brought a suit in which they call the K-Side Agreement. It's a suit against 3 levels of government and the Waterfront Toronto organization that leads it, calling the effort historically unprecedented, non-consensual, inappropriate mass capture, surveillance, and commoditization of personal data, right? These are strong words. So there does seem to be a backlash against smart cities in the West. This comes from a number of challenges, which we've heard about all of these really today, and we've heard about some possible solutions. So lack of meaningful consent, private data collected from public interactions, the privatization of both infrastructure and data, repurposing of data from the Internet of Things, right? So you buy a Nest thermostat to control temperature in your house and maybe lower your carbon footprint, not with the intention of letting anyone on the internet know when you're coming and going from your house, but that may be the effect. And storage of data on the cloud. So from there, I want to start moving to China. This is a concept that I'm developing, the idea of smart authoritarianism, and this is in response to kind of more traditional views of authoritarians as a little bit kind of ham-fisted, not all that sophisticated. China's leading the way, but other countries are rapidly following. It's a system that uses information intelligently, continually innovates, and recruits allies outside the state in order to target both co-optation and repression as efficiently and effectively as possible. And I argue that this is what China is doing. Of course, one of the most notorious and sophisticated tools for this is the Great Firewall, this Chinese system of internet censorship. When it was first launched, it was actually kind of a joke. It's hard to remember. But today, it's incredibly sophisticated, fine-grained, almost real-time responses to censorship challenges, and they target possible action, citizens protesting rather than free speech, right? So it's, again, very fine-grained, sophisticated tool. And I also want to point out, because this is going to be important, it relies on sensors that are embedded in Chinese companies. So they're from agents of the Chinese state. They're actually working in these companies. These companies are actively censoring themselves on behalf of the Chinese state. Okay, so one of these companies is Alibaba, right? Founded by Jack Ma. It's a well-known international brand. They've developed something called CityBrain, and this uses data from the Internet of Things, IoT, data analysis, cloud computing, and automation to help enforce various kinds of public order concerns in China. And not just China anymore, because they're now actively selling this abroad. Kuala Lumpur has already signed on to develop the same system. A very small example, almost really a superficial one, but one you'll see very commonly, are Shanghai's anti-jaywalking sidewalks. You can see here, this woman is a jaywalker. She is identified with facial recognition software with her name and picture are then published in an effort to publicly shame her for jaywalking, right? So this is the kind of thing we're talking about. I don't even want to bring up the social credit system, although it certainly would fit in nicely here because it's very diverse. Research on it is very preliminary, and it's really a topic almost unto itself, but that would fit in nicely here. Now, one of the places China's authoritarianism is maybe not as smart as it could be, or really just showing a lack of concern for privacy in general, a security researcher, I think last year, found that a major smart cities database in China had no password on it. It was up on the cloud with no protection whatsoever. He was able to simply go in and look at it. So this obviously raised concerns about data that's up on the cloud, but also gave us some insight into Chinese surveillance, right? So here's a picture of this database that the area was capturing. That's actually the embassy, foreign expat kind of area in Beijing. Here's some pictures of the slightly anonymized data. So we're capturing age, gender. There's an attractiveness score for reasons that I can't fathom. And this is being linked to police databases where they're identifying the real names. These characters are all real names of people, or at least supposedly those people. Who's to say, right? We don't have any idea of the accuracy. So here's a more complete list of the kinds of things this facial recognition software is identifying. And some of these first ones might be objectionable kind of broadly, but when we get down to ethnicity, this is really troubling, right? In a state that's locking up, detaining about 1 million Muslims, mostly ethnic Uyghurs, right? That they're identifying people's ethnicity. And the real-time interaction with police records also raises huge concerns in a state like China, and really in kind of any policing context. I do want to point out, though, that it's not really about technology. Technology is an important piece here, but a lot of China's most egregious human rights violations have really relatively little to do with technology. They didn't need smart cities technology to lock up and detain approximately 1 million Muslims. They didn't need it to detain the Falun Gong. They didn't need it to detain Christian and other dissidents. In some cases, it's helpful, but that's not really what this is about in a lot of ways. So we do have to be a little careful, and China still is operating a lot of this dumb, what I call dumb authoritarianism, as opposed to smart, sophisticated authoritarianism. So now I want to move to the US. How does this match? This is where you're going to see a lot of the same themes we've been seeing throughout the conference. I feel like my thunder has been stolen by almost every speaker up here before, but that's probably a good thing since I'm near the end. So obviously there's the Constitution, and in particular the Fourth Amendment, right? And I'm going to argue those offer some possible protections, but I'm also going to argue that really democracy is going to be much more important ultimately, and democracy is going to need transparency into these mechanisms in order to function properly. Now, going back to the Fourth Amendment, I'm really nervous as a Chinese law expert with no JD whatsoever, offering up American case law, but apparently I'm doing it, so here we go. So in a concurring opinion, Justice Alito essentially argues that there is a legal, maybe even a constitutional difference between short-term and long-term surveillance. And so this actually offers really meaningful, or a possible meaningful way of having this data collected without having the potential for it to be abused. So this data, Internet of Things, facial recognition, and other data could expire in certain intervals, making it perhaps of high value for, say, mapping traffic for the day, but of limited value for some of the more kind of sinister or worrying uses of this data over the long term, right? Similarly, Carpenter, which is only from last year, states that the state law enforcement needs a warrant to access historical records of physical locations and cell phone towers. Now, a lot of this is because this is data collected by a third party, right? Now, law enforcement hasn't necessarily had trouble getting these warrants and subpoenas. However, at least we're involving a judge, right? We're adding that step. We are still keeping with basic constitutional protections here. Facebook and Google have been hit with thousands and thousands of search warrants and subpoenas. They've given some amount of data in about 80% of the cases. But I think it's important to note here that there is a possibility, at least, in the United States, in the West, that these companies are able to push back against the state when they ask for data. And so the state having some data and private companies having some data might actually be a great model, right? Because then if they can't talk to each other, if they don't share data, some of the more sinister uses of data might not be possible, right? And it's really notable, I think, again, with this contrast, this comparison with China. Chinese tech companies are not going to do this, right? If the Chinese state asks Alibaba for data, they're just going to get it. There's not going to be a warrant involved. There's not going to be a judge involved. There's not going to be any pushback. So that's going to be a big difference between these two systems. This is also where this idea of voting with your wallet, making choices as a consumer, as a citizen come in. It's really hard to make choices about the city you live in, your use of an electricity grid or public transportation. There aren't usually a lot of different options, but it's a lot easier to switch your internet security provider, your social network. And so if one option that these companies can offer is better data protection, and again, maybe they can help shield in some cases, from some kinds of state action. On the other hand, there may not be a way around this kind of data collection from a city grid. Now, we've heard about privacy by design. I don't want to belabor the point, but the basic principles of privacy by design are baking this privacy into the very way we develop these systems. And if we look at what this is about, and then we look at the example of China, surprisingly, China tends not to meet kind of any of these standards. Again, failing to even provide a basic protection for this data when it's stored on the cloud. Very little transparency into these processes. Private companies that won't push back against the state essentially at all. And then mixing core smart city functions like traffic management with police and state security functions, right? Which is something we've seen here, right? With Oakland capturing these license plates and then ICE using that data. It's going to be even more. In China, this is done by design. This is built into the system. Now, I'm actually going to say something slightly controversial, which is this isn't just because there are no legal protections in China, because there are some legal protections in China, right? There are chances to have public hearings. There are freedom of information laws and abilities to request for their equivalent of FOIA requests. And something that I study a lot, administrative litigation in China. So you can sue the Chinese state around these. That doesn't mean that this is going to offer effective protection. In fact, I'm going to put my political scientist hat back on and argue that really the best protection is going to be not legal, but democracy. It's going to be elections. It's going to be democratic norms. But this absolutely has to require transparency, which comes in the form of comprehensible consent. What data is collected, how long it's kept and where, who has access to it and how, and algorithmic transparency. So ultimately, the safeguard against kind of tyranny of data is going to be a safeguard against any kind of tyranny. It's going to be the democratic system. So thank you all very much.
You want to just stand up here?
Hello? Okay, should I go ahead? Yeah. So I want to thank the organizers for this super interesting day. Thank you for including me. And what I'm going to focus on is, as you can see, smart cities and human rights, sort of an alternative approach to urban intelligence, and one that starts with a human rights framework, which hasn't come up today. It sort of surprised me. This is under the title of comparative law, but human rights is our law. It's part of U.S. law. So I'm not really talking about comparative law, but I'm talking about an alternative forum for raising some of these issues and for developing or identifying standards and goals. So I'm all about frameworks, and we've heard from some of the earlier panels about how things changed. Actually, the very first speaker of the day talked about how things changed from Smart Cities 1.0 to 2.0. And then also people have talked about how things should change, maybe with more outreach to communities and with greater protections. But for me, I'm still looking for a framework to guide and explain those changes. And I'm going to pose that a human rights framework is something that could be looked at for that. I think it provides a mechanism for critiquing developments in China and elsewhere, as well as bolstering democratic safeguards in our own communities, including the Fourth Amendment and beyond. And in fact, the issue of privacy is particularly identified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But also, all the other values that we've talked about are also part of that human rights sphere. So the idea of community and values and so on are also part of that. Tina Reuter, an anthropologist at the University of Alabama, recently observed that, quote, much of the smart city agenda does not seem to acknowledge the fact that in the end, the city is made up of humans. And we've heard that theme throughout the day. Humans need compassion and dignity and opportunities for individuality. And instead, the focus of smart cities, certainly initially, was on so-called neutral technological solutions to problems that reduce the city's inhabitants to no more than consumers and data gatherers. But we've heard today that the smart city agenda isn't neutral. It affects how people interact and how people perceive their community. And it can also reinforce marginalization of certain communities that may not have access to technologies that are being implemented. And the smart city has been criticized as having very little to say about existing and, in fact, even widening inequalities in the city. It doesn't deliberately address those. As we heard this morning, Smart City 2.0 seems to have adopted some ways of looking at that by including more co-design and outreach to the community. But I think we need to explore why that's, what is the standard that we're groping for as we go down that road. Just last week, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, who happens to be a professor at NYU, he released a report on digitized welfare, where he dug in on the fact that these technology agendas are not neutral. And instead he wrote, quote, the digitization of welfare systems has very often been used to promote deep reductions in the overall welfare budget, a narrowing of the beneficiary pool, the elimination of some services, the introduction of demanding and intrusive forms of conditionality, the pursuit of behavioral modification goals, the imposition of stronger sanctions regimes, and a complete reversal of the traditional notion that the state should be accountable to the individual. And he cautioned against digital authoritarianism and urged skepticism around digitization for its own sake. So I would argue that the smart city should be deliberately employed in the service of human rights, and with that as a framework, and that advocates can also actually use international human rights mechanisms to move that agenda. And that includes participatory processes for identifying priorities and shaping initiatives. We've heard about that today. Human-centered mechanisms for assessing the impacts of technology interventions. And given the dominance of technology companies in this space, it also means policing their commitments to human rights-based approaches. And the UN has developed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that are pertinent here. So there are standards out there that we can use. Now, there is, I think, a divide, has been a divide maybe between human rights and the idea of human rights cities, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, and smart cities. They haven't really been integrated in the way that they might be. But I think that there are things that smart cities could learn from communities that have embraced a human rights framework for their local governance. And these sort of so-called human rights cities include Vienna, Barcelona, Guangzhou, Korea, and in the United States, Pittsburgh is a good example, which is both a human rights city and also that call themselves a smart city. Pittsburgh has developed a framework where they engage community members, business, universities, and city leaders with the motto, quote, if it's not for all, then it's not for us. And so they really have tried to use a very inclusive framework as they develop their smart city approach. Beyond individual cities that have embraced a human rights framework, there are city coalitions that promote the human right to the city. And that really is focused on robust participation in and access to the city, such as the umbrella organization United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, which Sheila is very familiar with, I'm sure. So these approaches come together in the, I finally have a slide here. Is that right? No. There. These approaches come together in the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And the SDGs were born at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, and they came into force on January 1, 2016. And the objective was to produce a set of universal goals to meet the urgent environmental, political, and economic challenges facing our world. They built on prior goals, Millennium Development Goals that the UN had developed. And here I think we tend to think of the SDGs as very focused on the environment and climate change, but as you can see from looking at this chart, they really cover much more ground, and they provide a framework, I think, for interlinking issues of governance and rights with sustainability. And you'll see that, I think it's number 11 there is specifically about cities, but then there are others that certainly relate to urban issues. A few important points about the SDGs. One is that they are built on a human rights frame. So here, I can't see my own slide, but here are some, we pulled out the references to human rights in the SDGs, and you'll see that even though the, the focus is on sustainability and development, the human rights are sprinkled throughout the SDGs as being kind of a touchstone. They're universal. All nations in the UN endorse them. It's not a treaty. There's no mechanism for enforcement, but it is a global standard. The SDGs are being taken up by cities as well as national governments, and in some instances by businesses. So New York City, for example, was the first city in the world to file its own report on the SDGs, but a number of other cities have followed suit now. And the SDGs provide an opportunity for international coordination and dialogue around the elements of the SDGs, and an opportunity for both internal pressure within the community or the city or the nation that's preparing their SDG reports, and external pressure as these are presented internationally, and there's pushback from others that think that the particular reporter could do better. And it's an opportunity for pushing back against abuses of technology, such as the ones that John here was talking about. What happens is that reporting under the SDGs and as well as other UN mechanisms provides an opportunity for critique and comparison, and also an opportunity for civil society in those countries to raise their voices. The SDGs bolster and even expand the democratic safeguards that can keep smart cities from being mechanisms for authoritarianism. And one example is one of the initial initiatives described in New York City's SDG report is New York City Open Data, which they describe as the nation's largest free municipal data service. So they themselves have made the connection here between the SDGs and the use of the collection and use of data in New York. And the SDGs promote transparency, which is an important component of human rights and a check on government, and then participation. So I think I've got something here. Yeah, so here's about some stuff about the reporting there. So China is, of course, a tough nut to crack, and so I'm not suggesting that that a human rights framework is going to address some of the issues that my colleague here talked about. But I do think that in every city, expansions of technology can be framed and evaluated through a human rights lens. And that smart cities, we need to remember, is not a law-free zone. It's not an area where the technology companies or the cities themselves are just cooking up whatever standards they want to apply to their own practices. There's domestic law, but there's also international frameworks that are relevant here. And I think the SDGs, along with the knowledge and practices from existing human rights cities that are pioneering co-design and participatory governance mechanisms, are a roadmap to how some of these issues might play out in the urban intelligence sphere. Thank you.
So it's always daunting to speak last. I'll keep it brief, but first of all, thank you to the organizers, and for me it's always good to be back at Fordham. It's like a homecoming. I always say that I left my heart here, so when I come back I feel very much enveloped again in all the great things that are happening here, particularly on urban issues. In this law journal and this symposium is a great example. I've learned a lot today. So I wanted to talk about, since this is a comparative panel, a project that I've been running as part of our International Research Laboratory, LabGov. It's called the Co-Cities Project. And I want to give some examples of that touch on the conversation we've had here. But first of all, just to describe the Co-City Project, which is represented, the empirical part, by the map there. It's a theoretical, empirical, and also applied project that is international. Theoretically, we have, following up on Martha Davis's excellent presentation, worked up a kind of notion of the city and the various parts of the city as involving on some level, common assets and common goods, the city as a commons. And part of this is linked to the idea of the right to the city, which actually is a human rights framework, right? And Lefebvre first wrote about the right to the city, the right of people to be a part of the creation, the co-creation of the city. And then most recently, David Harvey, in his book, Rebel Cities, further explicitly says that the right to the city framework is a human rights framework. So a lot of what we've done in working up this theoretical, this framework of the co-city, is really to ground it as a way of instantiating the right to the city, because it's quite a kind of nebulous framework, and it's not clear how it gets grounded. And in doing so, to move beyond how we think about cities as either involving public or private, right? It's either the privatized city, as Gerald Frug wrote, or it's a city in which the city, the government, is the monopoly actor, right? And the idea is what's in between those two poles. And so we think there's a kind of stewardship model in which we can capture ways in which the city is being governed and its assets being co-governed by a collection of actors, and in particular, communities and residents and citizens that live there. So that's the theory. Their empirical part is we've mapped over a 5-year period, in over 100 cities now, about 500 examples of policies and projects that have resonance in this co-city model, and try to extract design principles from it. What would a co-city look like? And to do so both critically and analytically, and to code them and to show that cities are already making a transition, right, away from these polar binary choices of either it's a city in charge or we've given it all to private actors, to trying something different. And then finally, there's the applied part, and that is we're actually working in cities to experiment with some of these models. I brought it to the US right now we're in Baton Rouge, we're in New York City, but also we're in Amsterdam and a lot of Italian cities, Costa Rica and Brazil. And so all of this will kind of be presented in a book for MIT Press that we've also been writing for about 3 or 5 years, and that we're trying to come to change. So, but what I want to do today is just to not be normative, not be theoretical, and not talk about the applied stuff, but just to, I tried to pull a few examples from cities that I think are trying to make this transition away from the smart city to something that approximate more of a co-city model, and how data can be treated as a common good, right? Not something that the public authority collects and uses for its own purposes, even if they're good purposes, nor something that private companies like Airbnb just kind of collect and lock up. But so what are the possibilities in the middle? And so I just want to offer 3 and I'll end. One is, so we've heard a lot about Barcelona. Barcelona, under the current mayor and administration, moved from what was Smart City Barcelona, which was launched in 2011, to what they're calling the Barcelona Digital City, right? Which is, as Biljana mentioned, consisting of a roadmap to drive technological sovereignty. So the goal of the plan, and I just want to read it, is to promote a more pluralistic digital economy and make a new urban innovation model possible based on the transformation and digital innovation of the public sector and the involvement of companies, administrations, academics, organizations, communities, and people with a public and citizenship-based leadership. So what does this mean for them? A number of initiatives are coming up through this framework of the digital city, which has human rights at its framework, and even a right to the city and the right to data, really the right to use data as a common good. And to explicitly reduce the digital gap among urban residents in that city. So one thing is this Decode project, Decode Barcelona. Barcelona is one of 4 European pilot cities that are trying to show the wider value that comes with individuals being given the power to take control of personal data and given the means to share that data differently. Amsterdam is another. And under the umbrella of this Decode pilot, Barcelona launched platform DSI for BCN, which is, I won't even try to deconstruct that, which tries to foster innovation and data sharing in communities to collaborate to solve social problems. And as part of that, they have an online platform, which they're now known for, called Decidem Barcelona, which is a digital democracy platform where urban residents can participate in shaping public policies and in participatory processes. These are all pilot projects. We're continuing to monitor what's happening in Barcelona, but very much so, the idea is to, again, along with a number of actors, but putting communities and residents, giving them some power over this data to figure out how to use it in a way that is truly shared and that creates some degree of sovereignty. Second is I want to talk about urban labs, and in particular the Laboratorio para la Ciudad, the laboratory for the city in Mexico City. But there are other urban labs. Washington, D.C. has an urban lab. We helped design a lab in Bologna, Italy, called the Office of Civic Imagination. And one of the things that these urban living labs have in common is their experimental and participatory nature, and that they're user-centered. And one of the key processes of the urban living labs and of the Mexico City lab is, again, this co-creation process, this idea that the essence of a lab is to find solutions together with the ultimate users, with ultimate communities, rather than just applying solutions from top down. And so what Barcelona has done is to make a large use of digital and data tools, such as the Ciudad Propuesta CDMX, which aims at improving the development of neighborhoods even as far out as on the edge of Barcelona, of Mexico City, which is a city of 22 million people. It's amazing that this laboratory has been able to engage many communities through this lab, but to employ data and digital tools, really to allow the citizens and the communities to co-design their own development, their own housing programs, et cetera. So there's a website, if you speak Spanish, Mejora tu Barrio, CDMX, which is an interesting example of that ongoing experiment. And then finally, here in New York City, we were working with Jose Serrano McLean, who was in the city on launching what's called the New York City X Co-Labs, which were launched in 2017, the first municipal program to bring data that the city has and to work with tech companies in particular communities like Brownsville, Brooklyn was one community to, again, use data and technology with communities to figure out creative solutions, in one case to enhance public spaces and to make them safer, and to have citizens come up with these solutions using the data that the city has and their own data, and then kind of sharing that amongst themselves to boost economic, civic, and cultural opportunity for residents. And the other challenge was a zero waste and shared space, which was in public housing. Again, working with the mayor's office on technology, the Department of Sanitation, and the Housing Authority, with data and sharing at its center. So those are three examples that I think illustrate that cities are trying to do something, not just the private sector, but with private actors, with communities, using data and trying to instantiate this idea of the right to the city through the right to data, right? The right to use, the right to collect, the right to use it in ways that empower these communities. And so from these examples, one of a few of many, we've tried to extract some design principles, one of which we've concluded that's common to a lot of these projects is what we call tech justice, technology justice. That actually there is a normative valence to a lot of these projects, to what the city's trying to do, and it's rooted in concepts of not just rights-based language, but social justice. Anyway, for more, go to labgov.city or labgov.georgetown. Thank you.
Thanks. So my job is, I am Susan Block-Lieb. I'm the Cooper Chair, and I feel like my job is to just walk away and let people do what they need to do. I do want to interject for 2 seconds as a scholar of international law and comparative law from time to time, and one who looks sociolegally at this context. I'm struck by the imagination with which we've attacked the word comparative for this panel, right? So we have case studies that are from one country, from a particular international treaty which isn't hard international law, and also from networks of cities that work together. And I'm struck by almost the anthropological nature of these examples here, and would invite us to think about what's going on here through the lens of Sally Engel-Mary and her vernacularization project of the human rights framework in various locations and on a more local level. But what I'd like to do is open it up to those in the audience. I'm sure there are questions. Can he's right behind you. He's very nearby.
Oh, okay, cool. Fantastic presentation. Really appreciated the refreshing sort of discussion on privacy, human rights, co-cities, and really challenging some fundamental assumptions about how we create cities and thinking about urban intelligence. One question I had, and this kind of came up in prior panels, is that fundamentally, if we're trying to work with public and private, especially private actors, and create these sort of cross-sectoral partnerships, how do we think about their incentives? So for instance, as well-intentioned as maybe some startups are around trying to create social impact, if ultimately they have a duty to their shareholders or they have other types of fiduciary duties, what are the limitations around that sort of corporate governance model? Or down the road, if they take VC funding, they will eventually have to make that choice that sacrifices potentially the rights of stakeholders or the impact of stakeholders, and consumers who are giving away their data. So I'm curious from a comparative context, if you've seen anything interesting around how better we can use new corporate governance forms so that fundamentally these cross-sectoral partnerships and collaborations can be fruitful and these incentives become more aligned around human rights, around having that duty to other stakeholders that are just not shareholders.
Go ahead, I'm gonna follow you.
You can also skip the
was gonna
question,
follow
it's totally
Martha.
fine.
You have to say
Yeah,
first.
okay, so I guess I would say I mentioned the guiding principles on business and human rights, and I think that those have been, even though it's not a treaty, I think those have been more successful than people had expected in terms of providing some guardrails and guidelines for how businesses proceed. And my perception of human rights is that it is law. I think it is law, but it's also an organizing principle, right? So it's also a principle for organizing consumers and organizing, constituents. And so to the extent that the guiding principles on business and human rights and other human rights frameworks are something that can galvanize the consumers or the shareholders of these companies to demand, particular kinds of behavior or particular kinds of levels of responsibility. I think that's really the role that human rights can play in that. And I think it's been, as I say, more successful than people thought, even with the guiding principles is something that is just soft law, that is not, because of that, because the constituents and consumers of companies have demanded more responsiveness.
So I think that's a good question, and here's how I think about it. I think about it a little bit differently. I think incentives is probably the right question to ask, but so here's how I think about it. When when the legal profession needed to diversify, particularly at the top in law firms, and they weren't doing so, right? That the way that began to happen is companies came to law firms and said, we're only going to hire your law firm if you have diversity on your legal team, right? And so I see this through a kind of broader political economy lens. So what's happening in a lot of these cities is that cities, just to take the broad view, cities have become a very powerful economic actor, right? Because most of GDP is being produced, in particular in the mega cities, right? Tokyo produces, I think, 60% of Japan's GDP, and the top 10 metros in the US, 35%, the top 20, 55%. So cities can flex their economic power much in the way that corporations did with law firms, and they can say to these companies, right? They may not be able to get their data, but they can say to these companies, if you're gonna do business here, we are now moving from being this kind of city to a cooperative city, and you're gonna have to do X, Y, and Z and work with us around these communities to do this, or we're gonna, in order to get this tax write-off, et cetera. So that's why we're particularly focused on the political and the policy moves that's happening in these cities, and the shift as a policy matter. You know, what is policy? It's a choice between options, right? And so when cities make these shifts, then it's important that it happen as a city, not as a monopoly actor, but the city as an economic actor. And once you get the policies right, then I think even if these companies don't have a taste for this kind of work, that in order to play with these mega cities in particular, but not only, but in order to play with the cities, they've got to, you know, innovate in this way. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Is there another question? Yeah, right behind you, next to you.
I wondered if you, the panel, would care to comment on the fact that the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, as well as Jerry Nadler, Elizabeth Warren, are all behind breaking up the big tech monopoly capitalist companies because these companies are using the surveillance model of business. And if the United States does not lead this charge, then certainly the Europeans will fine and regulate these companies that have gotten totally out of control. So I wondered if you could comment on that cheery subject.
Well, I think, you know, one thing to consider, this is a very small answer, but it's coming from where I tend to come from, which is the kind of Chinese perspective is, one fear I have is, okay, you can break up Facebook, you can regulate Facebook, and then what's going to be the most socially popular social network in the rest of Asia? Is it going to be an American company like Facebook, or is this an opportunity for China and a Chinese company to take over these markets? And is that really a better outcome, right? So that's a fear that I have. Not very helpful or cheery.
Do we have another question? Can I thank our panelists and everyone who was earlier here today?